I first noticed it in the tablet copies. No catalog asks you to stare at for long. Not the clean museum summaries. Not the mythological index. The damaged photographs, where a reed mark becomes a shadow and a shadow becomes the only surviving witness. The phrase repeated there was simple enough to domesticate. Black sun. But the surrounding lines were not simple. They measured heat without brightness, shadows without direction, animals falling silent before priests could name the change. And beside the phrase sat the date that made safe translation impossible. 10,800 BC, before the sky reset. The fragment enters the record quietly, which is how dangerous fragments usually survive. Not as a proclamation, not as a tablet placed beneath glass with its meaning already settled. It appears in broken copies, late hand lists, uncertain transliterations, photographs flattened by museum light until the cuts in the clay look accidental. The phrase translated most safely as black sun is given a place inside the normal furniture of scholarship. Solar omen, eclipse formula, underworld epithet, ritual darkness. Each label performs the same operation. It moves the phrase away from the sky and returns it to literature. That movement matters because once the black sun becomes a symbol, no one has to ask what conditions required the phrase. No one has to ask why the surrounding lines do not behave like praise, prayer, or ornament. They behave like notes taken from a damaged procedure. Animals refusing open ground. Water losing its bright correspondence with the heavens. Shadows appearing without a fixed source. Heat continuing after light had ceased to reassure the body. Priests measuring a day that remained a day, yet no longer gave the ordinary answers by which a day is known. I want to be precise. The tablet we have is not an intact eyewitness diary from 10,800 BC. It cannot carry that weight honestly. What survives is more difficult. A Sumerian transmission of an older claim, copied through hands that may no longer have understood the full context, yet preserved the same cluster of details. The phrase, the bodily conditions, the failed measurements, the date. The date is where the official reading yearns to protect itself. 10,800 BC sits before the approved architecture of memory, before dynasties, before the city in the safe textbook sense, before the institutional world in which Sumerian tablets are supposed to become useful to historians. To leave the date standing would force an uncomfortable possibility. That scribal culture inherited material from a depth of time it did not originate, and that some part of that inheritance concerned the sky not as mythology, but as a system observed with practical seriousness. So the date is made fragile, a corrupted sign, a scribal slip, a ritual number mistaken for a year, a damaged notation whose value later readers have taken too literally. These explanations may be reasonable in isolation. Ancient copies break, numbers migrate, signs resemble one another under erosion. But none of that explains why the same unacceptable date remains attached to the same physical language. If the problem were only one damaged number, the surrounding evidence should become ordinary once the number is removed. It does not. The text still distinguishes between night and the condition being described. It still insists the sun was present, but wrong. It still carries bodies into the record, field workers, animals, temple observers, people whose relationship to light had become unreliable. It still gives us an archive preserving not a story about divine mood, but a memory of environmental failure for which later theology became the safest container. This is why the last Sumerian matters, not because we can recover his name. We cannot. He has disappeared into the anonymity of the copy room, into the reed marks of a profession that kept civilizations legible while leaving its workers invisible. But the posture of the copy remains. It does not read like invention. It reads like duty near the end of a chain. A man copying an older line because the line had already survived too much handling to be casually corrected, and because removing the impossible part would have been another falsification. He may not have known what the black sun was. He may have copied from an omen series, a temple excerpt, a broken astronomical list, or a school text whose oldest layer had already lost its instruments. But he knew enough to leave the problem intact. He did not translate it into comfort. He did not reduce it to a god. He left the phrase beside the date, and the date beside the failure of ordinary daylight. The official summaries depend on a selective view of ancient precision. The scribes are treated as exact when they list grain, canals, debts, eclipses, kings, and temple inventories. They become confused the moment a record points beyond the permitted boundary of historical memory. Precision is granted when it serves chronology, and withdrawn when it threatens it. That distinction is doing considerable work. If the black sun were simply an eclipse, the language should narrow around covering duration, fear, release. Ancient observers knew that drama. What appears here is stranger. The day does not end. The sun is not merely absent. Light remains altered. Heat remains without trust. And shadow no longer performs its ordinary function. The phrase survives because it names not darkness, but a damaged relationship between sky, earth, and witness. The first mistake is to imagine the black sun as an image, a disk gone dark, a celestial wound, a frightening emblem that can be filed under omen language and left there. That is the safest version, because an image can be interpreted without changing the structure of anything outside the text. It can be called theological. It can be called poetic. It can be compared to other darkened suns in other traditions and then returned to the shelf. But the older description does not stay inside the image. It moves downward into conditions. It concerns the way distance failed to clarify, the way heat remained present without ordinary brightness, the way animals lowered themselves before men understood the change. It concerns water losing its reflective agreement with the sky. It concerns watchers whose task was to divide the day and whose divisions no longer held. These are not decorative details. They are the residue of measurement after the measuring system has broken. This does not allow a modern category to be imposed cleanly. I want to be precise about that. It does not prove comet, eruption, dust veil, atmospheric collapse, plasma event, or solar disturbance. Those names belong to systems of explanation the tablet does not possess. What matters is more basic. The record describes a world in which light, heat, shadow, timekeeping, and animal response ceased to agree with one another. That is not how eclipse language normally behaves. An eclipse has sequence: approach, darkening, terror, release. The sun is covered and then uncovered. The ordinary order is violated, but the violation has a recognizable arc. What appears here is less theatrical and more structural. The sun remains named. The day remains day. Yet the things that make day usable no longer function together. The sky is not absent. It is misaligned. That is where the phrase solar reset begins to lose its strangeness. Not a machine in the modern sense. Not a lever pulled behind the heavens. A reset in the older, harsher sense. The re-establishment of order after a rupture large enough that old measures could no longer be trusted. If the atmosphere changed how sunlight reached the ground, or if the sun's behavior appeared changed through whatever stood between sky and witness, then everything dependent on the old regularity would require correction. Planting seasons, flood expectations, watch intervals, temple rites, labor counts, storage plans, royal authority itself. Calendars were never merely ceremonial. They were administrative instruments. They told a city when to plant, when to collect, when to store, when to open canals, when to gather workers, when to perform the rituals that made practical order appear sacred. A calendar is what a civilization uses when it wants the sky to become policy. If the sky changes, the calendar does not simply become inaccurate. The state loses one of the proofs that it knows where it is in time. The tablet seems to remember that kind of loss, not in the language of explanation, but in the language of leftover function. The later scribe preserves the phrase because the phrase has authority. He preserves the date because the date belongs to the inherited structure of the line. But the instruments that once made the record operational are gone. The observational culture has thinned into formula. What remains is a sentence shaped like a broken manual. This is how technical memory usually declines. First it is procedure, then instruction, then ritual, then story, then metaphor. At each stage it becomes easier to transmit and harder to use. By the time the modern institution receives the fragment, the safest category is waiting in advance. Mythology, solar omen, cultic expression, underworld symbolism. The words are preserved, but their possible function is removed before the question can form. And once function is removed, no one has to fund the harder inquiry. Was 10,800 BC a corrupted notation, or a preserved marker from an older sky event? Was the black sun a god, or a visible condition later theologized because no better vocabulary survived? Were the damaged descriptions around it poetic repetitions, or the remains of environmental observation carried forward by scribes who inherited a record older than their own explanatory world? These questions have not been answered at scale. More importantly, they have not been made institutionally necessary. Refutation leaves traces, competing reconstructions, formal rebuttals, failed replications of the reading, methodological pressure applied directly to the claim. What exists here is softer. The date is treated as corruption before the cluster is examined. The physical language is dissolved into symbol before its consistency is tested. The copyist becomes anonymous precisely where the act of copying becomes most revealing. That is not refutation. It is removal by classification. The black sun survives because translation can tolerate a dark god. The solar reset disappears because taking it even provisionally seriously would require joining fields that modern scholarship prefers to keep separate: mythology, climate memory, archaeoastronomy, catastrophe, temple administration, and the age of inherited knowledge. Once joined, the tablet no longer asks what the ancients believed, it asks what they remembered. This is how erasure usually works when the object itself cannot be burned. It is not hidden, it is named too safely. It is given a catalog number, a translation note, a shelf location, a cautious paragraph in which the dangerous portion is surrounded by words that make it professionally invisible. The tablet remains available. The phrase remains printed. The date remains present as damage. And after enough years, the absence of inquiry begins to look like the natural result of scholarly judgment. 10,800 BC is the unacceptable center, not because a single damaged number can prove an event. It cannot. Numbers copied across long transmission deserve caution. But caution is not the same as automatic dismissal, and the automatic dismissal here protects more than philology. It protects a chronology in which organized memory begins late. Technical sky observation develops slowly, and anything preserved from before the permitted horizon must be religious imagination by definition. The tablet violates that arrangement, so the violation is relocated into the tablet, a corrupt sign, a mistaken copy, a symbolic count. These explanations may each contain part of the truth. I want to be precise about that. but none of them explains why the same cluster continues to hold together. The wrong sun, the altered shadows, the distress of animals and water, the failure of ordinary timekeeping, and the impossible date placed not beside a king or a temple delivery, but beside a condition of the world. If the problem were only one damaged sign, the pattern should collapse when touched. It does not. And that brings us back to the last Sumerian, not as a prophet, not as the hero of a lost age, but as something quieter and more unsettling. The final functioning hand in a chain of transmission. He writes near the end of a record world whose tablets are still physically present, but whose operating knowledge has already begun to withdraw. The schools still teach signs. The temples still preserve lists. The copyists still move older words into newer clay. But somewhere behind the formulae, original use has thinned into inherited obligation. That is the condition in which warnings survive best. He may not have known what the black sun physically was. He may not have possessed the older instruments, the older observational discipline, or the older calendar logic that gave the line its first precision. He may have copied from a broken exemplar already distant from the event it preserved. But he knew enough not to improve it. He left the impossible part in place. He left the phrase attached to the date, and the date attached to the failure of order. That act matters more than his name. The official record can tolerate ancient fear. It can tolerate blackened gods, ritual darkness, omens before kings, symbolic suns descending into the underworld. Those things are legible to the categories already waiting for them. What it cannot easily tolerate is an ancient record behaving like a technical memory of environmental rupture before civilization is supposed to possess such memory. It can absorb poetry. It can absorb symbol. It cannot absorb an archive that points backward past the wall built to contain it. So the wall becomes invisible. We inherit the result as tone. The translator sounds careful. The catalog sounds neutral. The museum drawer sounds silent. The damaged line is presented without urgency, and the lack of urgency becomes part of the argument against it. Serious people have not made the question central, we are told, and therefore the question must not be serious. But that is not how knowledge is disproven. That is how knowledge is trained to remain peripheral until peripherality becomes indistinguishable from disappearance. What did the last Sumerian think he was saving? A myth, a warning, a calendrical correction, a memory from a destroyed sky science, a record of a day when the sun remained above the world, and yet the world could no longer read it. We do not know. The clay is too damaged for certainty, and certainty would be the wrong demand. The more honest question is why uncertainty has been permitted only in one direction. We are allowed to doubt the date. We are not encouraged to doubt the frame that makes the date impossible. The tablet still waits under safe names. The black sun remains present, but wrong. The solar reset remains a phrase no serious index wants to require. And somewhere between myth and measurement, between a broken sign and the institutional need for it to be broken, the last Sumerian leaves us the thing official culture most efficiently removes. Not an answer, but permission to ask. The algorithm, of course, would prefer you moved on.